Hey everyone, so we're back. This is part 2 of our jeans copying pattern tutorial. So I've already cut out my muslin here and we're going to sew this together to make sure that our pattern works and it fits properly and it matches our jeans pattern as much as possible. If you haven't already seen the part 1 video, I suggest you watch it or scan through it just to see what we're doing. But now we are sewing our prototype together. We're going to make sure it fits, and hopefully it fits really good. If it doesn't fit, we get to alter our pattern, so that could be a nice little lesson for you. It's not the most fun part. Well, it could be fun for some of you, but for me, it's a little bit of a hassle. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I like things to be done the first time properly. So I'm hoping it fits. And we are going to use a straight stitch sewing machine. I have an industrial one, but you can use a domestic. It doesn't really matter. Also, it doesn't matter what thread. I'm just using whatever thread is in here. But keep in mind when you're sewing that you do the proper seam allowance that you planned for on your pattern. We talked about seam allowance in the previous video, and I added 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to all the seams except for the waistband seam. And remember, we didn't do a waistband in the first video, so after we perfect this pattern and the fit is right, then we're going to draft our waistband. And so if I sew these pants together and you're wondering why there's no waistband, that is why. But we're going to sew this exactly like how we would sew our regular jeans. However, I'm not going to serge the seams closed or anything. I'm just going to straight stitch because sometimes you have to pick them out and release the seam if it's too tight, and that's where you got to adjust that on your pattern. So it's a good idea to make sure you sew that with a straight stitch, but also don't make your sewing your stitch length too close together in case you do have to rip the seam or pick it out. It can be a little much of a hassle if there's too many stitches. I will press all the seams out. Pressing is very important. Don't skip that part. It's very tempting when you're putting together a prototype of your pattern. It's very tempting to skip the pressing part, but that part is very important just because it allows you to see exactly what you're doing and where the seam is. So I've got all my pattern pieces here. I'm not going to worry about putting a zipper or anything in, but I will sew it as close to the finished product as possible so I can make sure everything fits properly. And be sure to subscribe to my channel so that you know exactly when I release all these new videos. So first up on our list is our front pockets. I've sped all this up so you guys don't have to watch as long, but first I want to talk about a seam guide. It's that little metal seam guide, and it's perfect for guiding our stitch and making sure that it is even. So to measure our seam allowance, I use a ruler. I measure that out. I put my seam guide there. Then we're going to start by sewing in our front pocket facing. And it's a 1 centimeter seam allowance for our front pocket facing. Don't forget, that's on our pattern. Stitch that on. And this is our muslin, so it doesn't matter what color thread we're using, just whatever's cheap. Always make sure you back stitch rather, and make sure that your pockets are on the right side. So when you're sewing pocket facing, you sew the pocket onto the outside and then flip it under, but you'll see exactly when I do my jeans. This is just our muslin to test our pattern, okay? We always do a muslin to make sure that our pattern fits. So we do it out of really cheap fabric. I have cotton muslin, it's $3.70 a meter, but if you can find cheaper, just make sure it's as close to whatever fabric you're making your finished garment out of. Okay, so we're continuing on with the back yoke. We're going to stitch from the outside seam to the center back here. And I've got a little issue there on my yoke, so I'm gonna have to revisit that on my pattern. So because there's the issue on the one side, we're gonna make sure that we sew the other side the same. So from the outside toward the center back. And make sure you line up your seam so that or make sure you line up your fabric or your pattern pieces so that the seam is lined up where you're gonna stitch it, so that it's not off slightly, and then you'll get a more accurate stitch. So you can see that the corner of the yoke is kind of sticking out a little bit, right? And that's because I've lined up my pattern piece right at where the seam is, where I'm going to sew. That's how you go more accurate. And I hope you don't mind that it's a little bit more sped up. I find that I want to get through the stitching everything together. So just make sure that you are accurate with your seam allowance. That's really important. And we're going to finish the outside pocket, but first we're going to put our pocket facing onto our pocket lining. So that's the facing, and it's going onto the pocket lining, quote unquote, even though it's the same fabric. And just make sure that you've sewed the pocket facing onto the right side. If it's on the outside or if it's reverse, I mean, it's a muslin. You'll see what I'm talking about when you look at it. And we don't need to sew on the outside seam, so just sew the top and stitch around the curve like I'm doing. When you're sewing on a flat surface like I am, it's really easy to sew around a curve. You just put your hand flat on the fabric to keep it flat. So I recommend that if you are sewing at home. Your sewing is going to be a little bit different if it's a raised surface. So if you have a sewing machine and it's on top of a table, you'll have to hold the fabric differently from what I'm doing. Always make sure when you start sewing that the thread is underneath and behind the presser foot. That way you won't get any knots. So if you're a beginner sewer and you're getting knots all the time, try just putting your thread behind your presser foot before you start, and that should work out really well for you. If you're sewing around a curve and you notice the fabric is bunching, just make sure your needle is inside the fabric. Lift the presser foot up and just adjust it. It's pretty easy. And you saw I used my ruler there. I use my ruler to make sure that I'm at the right seam allowance. I've got that seam guide. You can't see it because it's on the other side, but that seam guide is what I'm making sure I'm measuring, because I like the seam guide there. So now we're sewing our fly facing on, and it doesn't matter which side you sew it on, but typically if you're going for gender, the fly front facing goes on the left side for men's jeans and on the right side for women's. So men's jeans open from the left, so the left is on top, and on women's the right is on top. I've sewed this where the right is going to be on top, but that's okay because it's just gender in clothing doesn't really need anything. And again, this is just a test to make sure our pattern fits. So I'm not gonna go into what side everything gets stitched on. When we actually sew the jeans together, that's when you'll see how everything goes together. And I've made a little bit of my zipper is too big for my facing, so just keep that in mind. I'm sewing my zipper in so you can see how I do a fly front facing really quick, but my zipper is too big for my facing. Okay, and we make sure that I've trimmed off that little extra bit on my yoke that was hanging over so that the seam is nice and matched perfectly. Now we're going to, I pressed all my seams flat before I sew them together, just so I get a more accurate reading there. And if you remember in the previous video, I did 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, or 3/4 of an inch on most of the garments seams. So if you're a beginner, just do 1 centimeter on everything. But I've indicated with notches where my seam allowance is. And when you're sewing the center back, you don't sew all the way to the edge where the inseam is. I'm indicating here that I'm starting at where my seam allowance is, and then I'm sewing up. So I'm measuring that 3/4 of an inch there, and that's where I'm going to start sewing the center back seam. That's because when you sew the inseam, you have to sew the inseam up each pant leg, and then you stitch across from the crotch so that it lays really nice. And this is what I'm doing here. So I'm ensuring that I have some seam allowance so that when I sew the inseam, and this is all what you're going to see in the next video when I actually make the jeans. I'm going to explain that more. But if you just notice what I'm doing here, I've started 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, or 1.5 centimeters seam allowance in, and then I'm sewing from the crotch up to the back on the center back. So this is our back that we're stitching together. We've already done the yoke. We're pressing the seams out every time we sew them together. And now we are edge stitching our pocketing so that this is a technique that you do so that your pocket edge, your pocket lining rolls under the fabric so you can't see it from the front, basically. So this is called an edge stitch, and we're stitching our seam allowance onto the pocketing. Okay, so when we fold our pocketing under, we're going to get a nice roll from our top fabric. And we'll visit this again when I do my part 3, which is when we sew our final garment together. I'm going to do actually this is going to be, part 3 is going to be the waistband and our pattern revision. Part 4 is going to be our finished garment, because I have some mistakes on my pattern here, and that's totally normal. I have some issues, and I'm going to revisit those in the next video and tell you what those are. So you can see we got our pocketing, and then we fold our pocketing in half. And I like to, this is not a necessary step. You don't need to sew the pocketing together. You can fold it in half and line up your facing with your side seam, and then just do a little back tack to secure that, because this isn't necessary to do. And now I'm showing you the mistake of my facing that I have to revisit. So on my pattern, my pocketing, I just fold it in half like so. I line it up with the edge, and I'm going to stitch my pocket together, but this isn't a necessary step because, again, this muslin is just to fit our pattern. So you can skip a lot of these steps as long as you ensure that your facing is in. That's going to be the most important. When you see me with my ruler there, that means I'm measuring a new seam allowance. So on this pocketing, it's a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I've adjusted my my stitch guide, that little magnetic metal thing, and I move that in 1 centimeter, and so that's how I ensure I get a nice straight line. So with that pocketing, I'm only sewing up to the pocket edge, the opening edge, right? I don't want to completely stitch that together accidentally. So you could just, at that edge there, just put a back tack. That's totally fine. Just to secure the pocket together so that when you try it on, it doesn't move around. And then remember to stitch to the pocket. If you are putting your pockets together, just stitch to the opening there. And then open it, and then you have your nice finished pocket there. So we're going to do the back pocket, and you remember on our pattern we added a roll hem for the top. So I'm going to roll that under, and I'm going to stitch along the edge of the roll hem. I did this a little backwards. If you were... No, actually this is right, because then we're going to attach it to our pocket and fold our seam allowance in before we edge stitch the pocket on. And I did 2 pockets. You only need to actually cut and sew on 1 pocket because this is a muslin, so you only need to see where you're going to position your pocketing on one pocket, and then you can try a different position for your other pocket to see how you like. So moving on, we're going to finish our fly front. So remember, we attached our facing onto the one side, and now we're going to do our folded facing piece on this side. And I am not super excited about the shape of my facing, so I'm going to change it in the next when we revise our patterns. I don't like that curve. I probably should have done a square. And if you remember, my zipper is a little longer than my facing. You don't want that. You want the zipper tape to start at the top of your facing and finish at the bottom. You don't want that extension, which I'm seeing. So I only have one zipper, and this is the zipper I'm using, but I just wanted to show you a quick way to do, the fly facing in case you needed to practice. So if this was the zipper for your garment, your finished garment, you could just rip out the zipper and use it in your garment. But if you've never sewn a fly front, if you're not the greatest at them, I suggest practicing on your muslin. So what I'm doing is I'm sandwiching the zipper into the leg piece and into my facing. So I'm adding my zipper foot. And you want a zipper foot is like a little kind of thin presser foot, allows you to stitch right to the edge of your zipper. Okay, so when you apply your zipper, you sandwich it in between the facing and the pattern piece. So the zipper is facing down. So if it's sandwiched underneath this, it's facing down. And the wrong side of the facing is the wrong side of the zipper is against my facing. And then I'm going to use that little thin zipper foot so that I can get as close to the edge at the zipper as possible. And we're going to sew. Now this is a little tricky because sometimes you have to unzip the zipper as well. So first what I'm doing is top stitching my facing here. So that's not a necessary step, but I recommend it. And I'm just adding industrial machines, you have two different zipper foots, but on domestics you have one and you just position it left or right. So you want to get as close to the zipper edge as possible. And see, I've applied the facing wrong side down and onto the facing, and I flip it over. Okay, and so the zipper is sandwiched in between. And now I'm going to stitch along that edge there. Now, an easier way would be to open the tape and pin it. So I'm opening the tape and I'm pinning right down. So I like to pin the zipper tape on so that it's positioned, and I usually remove the pins right before I sew, but I only remove them one at a time. And you want to go the best way to do it is from the bottom up. In my pattern, I've indicated a notch where the facing is supposed to start, and that's where your zipper and your facing all start, is at that notch. So that's where I'm pinning. And see how that zipper's overhanging? That's a little bit of a mistake. You don't want that. But again, my zipper's too long. But now we're pinning horizontally, so perpendicular to our zipper, right? And if that zipper pull is getting in the way, pin it first and then move it out of your way so that your zipper doesn't shift around. So that's what I'm doing here. It's a little bit in my way. So I'm going to pin the edge down, and then I'm going to zip it up slightly so that I can begin my stitch, because I had a little bit of an issue when I filmed this, and my zipper pull, I was just messing around with it too much. So when you start your zipper, zip it all the way up so it's closed, okay? And you can pin it on open. So you can open it, pin your zipper on, close it, stitch it together halfway, and then once you're halfway up the zipper, open it again and then finish. That's the easiest way to do it. All right, so I kind of mess around with these pins, but if you just follow that method where you pin it on, open the zipper foot, pin it on, close it, sew it halfway, open it again, and then finish your sewing. It'll be pretty easy. And I will be using a heavy duty metal zipper, and so there is a little, my advice, and I noticed this after I sewed this together, is that I added too much seam allowance to my fly front, my center front. So I'm actually going to switch my seam allowance and do 1/4 inch seam allowance on the front, because the zipper tape is 5/8 of an inch, and once I finish my fly front, you'll see that my zipper teeth are way too close to the edge underneath, and I don't want that. I want them out. You can see that right here. They're a little close, and I want them out about 1/8 of an inch from my seam. So if you watch the next video, I'm going to make those edits in that video, and I'll talk about it then. This is why I sew the zipper in on my muslin, so that I can catch all these, and then I have less headaches when I'm sewing my finished garment, because the fabric I bought is some really nice corduroy, and it's expensive. So I just want to do this in one go, right? And we're gonna spend a little bit more time doing fly front zippers, but I just wanted to kind of show you, obviously my zipper's too big, and I've got some mistakes going on, but we're gonna add the front part there, and so I lay it completely over top. All right, I match the seam allowance. So I've gone slightly over the center front by about 1/4 of an inch, or whatever the seam allowance is. And you actually rotate the jean front, so the other one, so that they kind of meet at the point at where your notch is. So that where I'm pinning is where my pattern notch is. And that's really important to include in your pattern, is the notch, because the notch is where where you sew everything to when you're sewing everything together. So now what I've done is I'm allowing for the zipper pull to gape, like to have some room over the fabric so it doesn't pull open when I put the pants on. Now I'm opening it. I'm checking to see if it lines up with my other facing that I sewed on at the beginning. And now we're going to sew our other side of our zipper edge to that under facing. Okay, so I flip the other facing out of the way that we just sewed on, and now I'm pinning the zipper tape to the other facing. I know it's a little confusing. So this is the other facing that we sewed on at the very beginning. We're pinning our zipper tape onto that, and then we're going to stitch our zipper tape onto this facing, and then we top stitch it down, and that's how we complete our fly front. So you want to make sure that the zipper tape is running parallel to the edge of your facing. So I've done that here, and that's how I'm going to get a really nice zipper opening. You can see how it's pinned on, and it lines up really nicely. The top of the zipper tape, that little V, you actually open it slightly and then stitch it on. So it should be sewed on in that V shape. You don't want to line it up with the zipper, because you'll get bunching when you zip up your jeans. So you open the V part and stitch it on, and that way it's going to lay nice and flat when you actually do up your zipper. And I'm doing this from the top down. The other way was from the bottom up, but we're doing this from the top down just so I can make sure that that zipper top is sewn down into that V. And we've continued on. You can see I'm running into some headaches because my zipper's too long. A little bit of a headache there. This is why I put the zipper in. It's an extra step just to check the fit of my pant, but you can never get enough practice with fly front zippers. So now that I've sewn that in, I'm just going to top stitch into that curved part that you see on jeans. And I don't know how many times I'm doing this again. I've folded that under facing out of the way, and I actually forget to fold it back the other way, and then I sew over it, and now it's like stitched down with a fold. So, in manufacturing, or what I've gotten used to doing, is I do one side of I do the straight top stitching, Then I backstitch it, and then I flip my facing over so that it lines up, and then I do my little curve and I put a couple of back tacks in. So you're going to see that. Now what we can do is finish our crotch seam. And remember, you are only sewing to 1/4 inch, or sorry, 3/4 of an inch to where the edge is. So only don't sew all the way down because you'll have to seam rip it. You can see I've left that little bit there, and there's our finished fly front facing, and it looks pretty good. Nice and sped up. So now we're going to do our inseam, and you're going to see this is why we left that extra bit there. We did a 1.5 centimeter or 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, which I've indicated with a notch. And I've got my little seam guide there lined up so I can just stitch along. And we're stitching this all the way to the edge. And this is why we left our 3/4 inch or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance right at when we were sewing in our crotch seams, because we need to actually sew this side all the way up to the edge. Actually, we're leaving our seam allowance here as well. We're only sewing up to our 3/4 inch seam allowance. So we're not going completely to the edge. So we're just doing up to the same as we did on our crotch, that 3/4 or 1.5 centimeter. And then you'll see what I do after. So you're kind of leaving like a little bit right at the crotch. It's kind of like open a little bit, and you'll see why we do this, because this is how they do them in manufacturing. And before I actually learned how to sew jeans properly, I was always getting like a weird bunchy like fabric thing in the crotch, and this is what gets rid of it. Stitching it this way. So I've only stitched to that seam allowance, okay? And what am I doing now? I'm doing the pocket. Before I stitch the side seams together, I'm doing the pocket. And remember, you want to line up your pocket to the waistband line, not your yoke. And you want to line it up to your center back. And depending on where you position your pocket, you can either make your butt narrow or wider. So if you want it more narrow, you do it closer to the center. If you want your butt to look wider, you do it more out. I'm positioning it right in the middle, and I'm keeping in mind that I'm going to top stitch where the yoke is. So I think that's a pretty good position right there. You can put your pocket wherever you want. It does give your butt a different illusion, okay? So if you want a higher butt, you move it a little higher. Those are little tricks that you can do to make your butt look optical illusion. So we're just edge stitching our pocketing down. Edge stitching means we go about 1 or 2 millimeters from the edge of the fold line here. That's what we're doing. So if you folded something under and you want to stitch it down, it's about 1 or 2 millimeters. So it's quite tricky and advanced. Take it slow if you're not used to edge stitching. It can be difficult and you can make mistakes easily. Okay, so now we're doing our crotch seam. So I folded the jeans from the center and the center front and center back. So that's where we're stitching them closed, is along that center line, so that the actual stitch line is kind of running from front to back along that edge. And do a couple of back turns, like forwards and backs here at the crotch, just to reinforce it. So you don't want your crotch to split open. Nope. And now we're doing the side seams, and after we're done the side seams, we are done and we can try them on. So again, it's that 1.5, 3/4 inch seam allowance. I say it all the time. And when you're doing when you're doing the outside seam, keep in mind the hip curve. Now, when you do the hip curve, you have to line up that pattern piece really well, and this is where notches come in handy when you're drafting your pattern. Is you put the notches when you true your pattern, and then when you're sewing your fabric together, you match the notches up, and that way you'll get a nice perfect sew when they sew together. Because sometimes if you don't ease the hip curve in properly, it'll come out longer on one side, and this is an issue that I had when I was sewing together my muslin here. So we're gonna have to, and this is why we do it, I'm gonna have to revisit my pattern and see if there's something off there, because when I sew it together it is slightly off by about 1 centimeter. And I stitch my pocketing down, so that's my front pocketing there. And I'm easing the side seams together, or the hip curve, the curved seam. I don't want to pull anything at this point because it will bunch on the side. Easing it in means you kind of allow it to you allow the fabric to have like it has no tension in it, basically. Okay, so yeah, this is just the outside, the other outside seam, and then we should be done. And I can't wait to try these on. This is always exciting for me. But I do have an issue with this side one. It's actually sewn worse, so it's like off by about 1/2 inch. When you get two side seams that are off different lengths, it's your sewing. It's not really that you cut it wrong, it's that you sewed one side wrong and the other one was probably better. So we're going to true our pattern, we're going to revisit our pattern again, but we have to keep that in mind. I have to keep that in mind when I'm sewing my finished garment, because I don't want to make these mistakes when I'm sewing my really nice, you know, $30 a meter corduroy. I just want to sew it once and be done with it, right? I don't want to have to seam rip it. That's how our fabric gets weaker, is when you have to seam rip it a bunch of times. And you can see my sewing is off, and I'm trying to ease in the side seam, but it's just not really working. It could be also that my feed dogs, which are those teeth underneath, they could be pulling too much underneath, so I'd have to maybe release the presser foot. And so what I'm doing is I'm stitching my pocketing down so that when I try it on, it doesn't open up and create a gape there. So that's my facing stitched onto my front pattern piece that I'm doing there. Just a little quick back tack, nothing crazy. And then that should be it. And we're gonna try these on after in 2 seconds. Typically, I guess men's pants are supposed to be on the other side, but it doesn't really matter. But so far so good. And so if you look at the bottom, I think they fit pretty good. Right? I think so. Looks good in the butt. The pocket looks like it's in a good spot. Yep. I think we are ready. Okay, so the muslin I feel like looks great. I'm gonna have to double check in a mirror. Can't really see it in this little screen here that I'm filming on, but so far it looks good. And then stay tuned for the next video. I'm gonna do my adjustments. We're going to make ourselves a waistband. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a video on that. I'm not gonna sew it on because I'm going to do a full jeans tutorial in my proper fabric with the adjustments made. This little the little part on the yoke, that's from my sewing. I don't think it's from my pattern, so we're just gonna ignore that. It's this part right here where it's sticking up a bit. So I'm hoping that that's just my sewing. because the other side wasn't like that. So I'm just gonna revisit my pattern one more time just to line it up and make sure that it's good. But otherwise, I think I'm pretty good. Let me know how you guys did with your muslin. And if you have any questions, make sure you leave a comment and I will try and help you out with that. But if you follow the directions of what I did in my previous video, your fit should be very much like mine. It should match your jeans perfectly. A lot of the times, if your jeans don't fit or if they're really small, it could be because you messed up on the seam allowance. It's something so simple, but it's a lot of the times, like when I was sewing, I actually had to revisit the seam allowance on my muslin pattern because I had even made that little bit of a mistake. Seam allowance can get a little tricky. One thing that I would suggest to anyone who's a beginner sewer is to just do a 5/8 seam allowance, and that's a standard seam allowance. And when you use your serger and your sewing machine together, that seam will lay really nicely with just a 1 centimeter or 5/8 seam allowance. So if you are a beginner, just stick to that 1 seam allowance when you're adding on to your pattern, and then you won't get confused. I even got a little confused, but that's just me. I want to do a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance because I have a 5-thread serger, so the seam allowance on that is required to be a little bit bigger. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to watch the next one where we finish our pants pattern. So it's going to be a little short one, and then the next one's going to be sewing our brand new jeans. I may do a corduroy pant. I've been kind of feeling like cords lately, so I think I'm going to do mine in corduroy. Might even do velvet pants. Not gonna lie, I'm kind of feeling the velvet, but we'll see. I think corduroy is going to be easier for me to get at my fabric store. Otherwise, use whatever heavyweight fabric you want, and take care and see you guys next time.